And welcome back to another episode of the Confident Defense podcast, where every week I'm sitting down with VCs, CEOs, and security executives, have these really honest conversations about how we as security and technology leaders can win in this infinite game of cybersecurity. So today I'm really excited. We've got an awesome guest. When he told me what he's doing in the security industry, it blew my mind. I'm still getting my head around it. I think it's one of the coolest innovations that I've seen all year so far. And our guest today is Maxime. Maxime is the co-founder of LimaCharlie. But before this, Maxime worked at Google, Google X, and CrowdStrike. And he started his cybersecurity career inside the Canadian intelligence, something I want to poke at and dive into a little bit in that conversation. During his time in in the Canadian intelligence, he was part of the CNE development and operations. So he went on to found LimaCharlie. LimaCharlie.io, which we'll link to in the show, is a platform for cloud-native cybersecurity tools and infrastructure. It's kind of like AWS for your EDR, XDR, SASE, artifact ingestion, and so much more. They talk about this idea of a DevOps approach to cybersecurity. There's so much to unpack here with LimaCharlie. I couldn't be more happy for this conversation. Maxime, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And tiny correction, it's Counter CNE in the Canadian government.
Oh, so you don't want them to exploit Canada. You're trying to prevent that. Okay, got it. So it's the Counter CNE. Okay, got it. So yes. So you're one of the good guys.
That's right.
So dude, let's talk about this. So why don't we start there with your time in intelligence in the Canadian intelligence? Because from my research, like you started your career there, you got going, that set up, but then you did your tour duty there, and my phrasing, and then left and moved into private industry. So I'd be really curious, like what prompted you? What got you started in the intelligence industry? And then also what got you out of the intelligence industry coming into private industry?
Yeah. So I started, I got hired right out of university into CSE. I'd done a couple of work terms, so like internships there. And it's a really unique kind of place. I mean, as you can imagine, and I think, it kind of had an advantage in being very insular compared to the rest of the industry. We were dealing with some, pretty cloak and dagger stuff, right? There's no way around it, right? Like that kind of thing. And so it kind of meant that there's a lot of innovation that kind of inherently was possible in that space, and it could be done without going and starting a company, right? It was very internal, and so there's a lot of this thing needs to be built, or we have the idea about building this thing. We could go and experiment and do it and get the results from it, without doing a business case, essentially. Or I'm going to be careful. Sure, there's business cases, but it's like government, business case. It's not like how much are you going to sell it?
Yeah, the ROI is measured differently.
That's right. But as like a new grad, right, just coming out of university, that was amazing because I feel like it started my career from kind of the open position, right, versus starting at a point where maybe you're junior somewhere and everything's defined for you. It's very much the opposite of that. So there is a ton that could be done that we experimented with. I did a lot of development internally, some low level development, like some C stuff around a ton of things. I did some operational aspect of things as well, which is like its whole different kind of thrill, and it gave me a vision of, I think, of cybersecurity, which was at the time really different than what was on the outside, which was, doing a thorough job was kind of its own thing. And there was no being afraid of complexity.
Okay.
We kind of very much embraced the idea of, like EDR before it was called EDR. threat hunting before it was called threat hunting.
So, so I don't want to oversimplify this because I think there's a lot in here, but you were building internal toolkits for the Canadian intelligence who would then go and use and dispose of as they wish. Like, so you're building the security tooling and infrastructure for them. Is that fair?
Yeah. That's I did a bunch of different things internally, but that was the biggest part of it. That's right. We can talk about it.
Okay, got it. Yeah. And that's like I love having guests on here who have these like really amazing storied histories, and they're like, yeah, but that door's closed, so we can't talk about that one. We can talk about the open doors over here. So that's really fair. So that's would it be so as you kind of got out of university, you're here in the Canadian intelligence, you start getting into both the operations and development of these toolkits. Like, why did you get into the building? Like what was the drive there? I'm just curious, like with all the opportunities you had inside that large apparatus, what drew you towards that?
Into kind of getting out of it. Is that what you mean, right? Or like,
so there's part of you that seems to be a natural builder. You love to just, and I think that has totally expressed itself in LimaCharlie, which we'll talk about in a second. But It's like, so there's part of you. So you was curious, like what brought you down that path?
And I think the answer is that it is building, but it's government is its own microsystem, right? And kind of saying like there's a lot of great things about that, but at a certain scale, for me, I wanted to go and build bigger things, and in modern society, for us, building bigger things ends up meaning building a company, essentially. Right? That's kind of the proxy for doing most things. And that's just not something that's compatible with the intelligence. It turns out. And I think that's something that's evolved a little bit, talking to previous colleagues around there, like things have been opening up a little bit. But when I was there, there was still and that's a super interesting aspect, but there's still a perception within the government, within the the intelligence agency, that what we were doing inside could only be done inside, only existed like nowhere else in the world other than inside. And if you look historically, you'd think about this that's what signals intelligence is kind of the term, right? SIGINT. If you looked at historically, those organizations were dealing with things like, we are picking up a dish that's sitting on a ship in the middle of the ocean, and it's picking up from a satellite that is talking to something in China, and we're trying to like decode some kind of like hardware encryption that's used in two places in the world. So as an organization, when they thought about what we did, it was obvious that if you wanted to do anything outside of that box in the public sector, it was like hard cut. No, it's impossible. Like you're going to be revealing state secrets. And I think that those organizations have evolved since, and they've been forced to into kind of realizing that, well, nowadays cybersecurity, like obviously there's still the radio wave stuff, but like cybersecurity is done in a lot of different places, and there's a lot of information out there that really isn't classified, a lot of concepts and all that. So for me, I kind of wanted to be able to expand out of that. And I kind of realized, at the time that box was very rigid. So I ended up leaving and going in private sector.
Got it. Okay. So that makes sense, because there is more freedom. And the problem is, you're right, is cybersecurity is obviously a way bigger problem than just what the alphabet soup of the 3-letter agencies have to deal with. So I totally agreed on that. And that began your journey, right? You went through CrowdStrike for a period of time, and then you were at Google for a while, then Google X, which is now Chronicle, in doing their security, which again, all mind-blowingly great companies. Then you went on to build LimaCharlie. And so I want to get your perspective on some other stuff inside of the security industry, but we can't not talk about this. So can you just, for the audience, just level set? What is this company you have built? So what is this company you've built in LimaCharlie, and then what are you hoping to get with it?
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, funnily enough, LimaCharlie actually started as the name of the open source project. Back when I was at Google, it was an open source EDR I was developing. So it originally was just an EDR. But now, we've kind of kept the name and really made the scope a lot bigger.
And sorry, I should have asked something up front. How did you guys name it LimaCharlie? Like, where did that come from?
That's a good question. It's kind of a dual story. One is, kind of the official one is LimaCharlie is NATO alphabet for loud and clear, LC.
Okay.
Pretty standard. But it is also at a more personal level. I did some of the development on what was going to eventually become LimaCharlie while I was working out of the south of France. And at the time, I would work every morning out of a cafe that was called the Cafe LC. And they were really patient with me, every day showing up with my laptop. So it was a little bit of, tip of the hat for them.
Nice. Okay. That makes sense. Cool. Okay. So we've got loud and clear, cafes and all. So out comes this open source project, which was around building an open source EDR. Right?
That's right. It was, it was a way for me to kind of scratch the itch of some of the things that I had been involved with in the government. So, leaving government, what I kind of realized and experienced is that the outside industry was, and still to this day, is very focused on the if we're talking like business wise, like on the down market, right? Meaning, here's the thing that everybody can use, and that's very good, and that addresses some aspects around like shortages of people in security and all that. But I got kind of frustrated because it felt like people on the outside, it sounds silly saying that, but like people on the outside were kind of used to that mode and didn't see the trade-off that they were making while making it, which is, it's good to have this thing that, I can give to anybody coming out of university and they can do cybersecurity. Right. But like, let's be realistic, right? What you put in is what you get. And what it means is that is very, very shallow. And again, on a bad way, there's a lot of very good things coming out of that.
And so just to clarify that point, you're talking about like, so this would be like your COTS, your software off the shelf that people are deploying across. I bought a firewall, I bought an AV, I bought a thing type of level of security.
Exactly. It's, I bought an AV or I bought an EDR and I can, let's talking a little bit technical, right? But like I can search for a hash for a domain name and an IP, and that's threat hunting. Yeah. And like for me coming from the government, it's like kind of looking around like that's barely threat hunting, right? Okay. Like, come on. And so I kind of felt that people were resigning in a way themselves to just that, like, no, that's what products are, and that's where they're at, and that is and always will be. So I wanted to put an EDR out there, kind of making the statement of like, no, it's quote unquote not that hard. Obviously, it's kind of a tongue in cheek a little bit, but one can make an EDR that is very, very powerful, that has a lot of depth, and can also be simple to use and deploy, and kind of all the things around that. So it was an open source EDR. And that was a super interesting learning for me. Like anybody out there who's thinking of doing an open source project, it requires as much sales and marketing as a product to go and get traction. But it was super interesting. And it was kind of for me a way to, do a proof of concept kind of in the world.
Yeah. Okay.
But then, leaving Google and Chronicle, it was an opportunity to kind of now go and say like, hey, okay, I did like the technical aspect, open source, that's cool. Let's really build something. And so the big question was, okay, what are we going to really build? We wanted this to be something interesting, right? People who know me know I kind of always joke, like, I didn't want to build a car wash, which is like, the product that like everybody knows exactly what it is. This is the market. I'm going to, sprinkle 3 engineers here and a little bit of sales here. And 5 years later, I'm going to have, $50 million company, and I'm going to sell it to some other company. Like,
that is an interesting prospect for a lot of people.
It is, but I've never been one to build the same old thing that everybody else is doing. I've always been looking at like, where can we go that nobody's been, and find the gold nugget there, not just in terms of like money, but in terms of like interesting things, right? And so EDR, for me, my personal call, EDR really felt like a car wash, because it's, how many EDR companies are there? And again, I said that pretty often, but like, if I tell you I have an EDR, I bet you can get 90%, you can guess 90% of the feature set.
Yeah.
And it's been like
becoming a little more operationalized, right? The shine has worn off. It's not 8 years ago, 9 years ago, when it was this, oh my gosh, for the first time we can see process chaining that makes network connections. We're never getting that out of an AV. Like, that was mind blowing at the time, right?
That's right.
And I think it was just that really for me personally, it was the acquisition of when Bit9 bought Carbon Black, and then they became Carbon Black. Like, my dad actually worked at Bit9 at the time, and he's like, "You gotta check this out, blah blah blah." And like, that was my personally my first exposure, and I'm like, this EDR thing's cool. But of course, that was like a decade ago or whatever, right? So you're right. It's become a little more, that particular use case has become very operational, rote. Like, it's pretty well understood. Yeah.
Exactly. So for me, so that was a little bit of a car wash. And so we kind of set out to say, like, hey, what are the trends? Like, what's really going on in security? And where are things going? Not necessarily today or tomorrow. We weren't like particularly interested in starting a company of secret sauce, right? Like, hey, we're a new cybersecurity company. We're quadrant, number 2 at Gartner, and we have the secret sauce. And like, I kind of felt like we were slowly getting a little bit past that. So the kind of trend that we saw that led to where we're going, right, is we looked at IT. We said, like, hey, where was IT, like 10 years like before? Because IT and cybersecurity feels like there's a parallel between them, right? They're not totally different. They're not quite the same either. So where was IT?
Understand them, but they always know it's their fault.
That's right. And 10 years ago, people would joke about, the IT, it's the 2 guys in the basement that come in and replace my monitor, right? When I need a new one. And like, it was kind of the joke, of a company in general, right? or caricature a little bit. And then that's where they were. But nowadays it's very different, right? IT now is like, it's a very professional industry. There's industry best practices. There's a bunch of accreditations, right? For depending on how you feel about that, but like, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of structure. There's a lot of builders, of people that go, you know what? I know how to build infrastructure to like coordinate all of the vendors that are used in the to build cars at General Motors. Like, that's a lot of IT. It's a very core part of the business, and we know how to do this. Mm-hmm. And overlapped with that was kind of a progression into products. So it used to be that you had very singular products, right? Like, back in the day, like, you used to buy, like, for consumers, you used to buy a product in a box, right? Yeah. On the enterprise, it would be like, hey, I'm buying a relational database. Ooh, right? This is enterprise. This is secret sauce owned by Oracle. Yeah. And then you look today and you're like, I tell you relational database, you don't really care what the brand is. You pretty much like 90%, I know what's happening. Hmm. So that's the kind of shift that we saw. And part of that shift came AWS, right? AWS came on in the industry and said, look, down market, like, easy to use stuff is great. And again, like, nowadays we still have a lot of that. Like, I always think of like Squarespace, right? It's really easy website to build your website. It's easy. That's great. And for a dentist's office, awesome. Build your website on Squarespace. But if, again, like, I always pick on like General Motors in a good way. But if you're General Motors and you're trying to build like international infrastructure to manage like suppliers, you're not going to go and start using Squarespace. Nowadays, you're going to be leveraging kind of this ecosystem where you can get access to the raw capabilities that you need very quickly, easily, painlessly. But it's the capabilities you need to do your job, right? If I work at General Motors as an IT guy, I'm not the one like coding relational databases. I just want access to one so that I know how to put the things together and kind of make it work, right? So that's the observation around IT. And then we kind of like looked around and said, like, where's cybersecurity in that progression, right? And we're getting out of that phase right now of the two guys in a hoodie in a basement, right? Nowadays, people get that security is a big thing. It's not the joke, of like the two guys in the hoodies. There's standards. There's the Mitre framework. There's all these things.
There's that professionalism again you were talking about, right? We've come out of two guys in the hoodie to being like, nope, we are a professionalized industry. We have expectations. We have dashboards and widgets. Like we measure things now, and we all wear ties to work. Yes.
Exactly. That's right. So it's not all good, but yeah, exactly. It's that's exactly what's been happening. So looking at this, then I kind of, for me, made the connection between what I used to do, which I feel like back in the government, it was very much in that space of like, hey, at that point we're a security professional. We know how to build the things that we need. Gained a lot of that experience. And then seeing that today, vast majority of products in security, not all of them, then that's getting better, and that's really great. But a lot of them are still very much in that like singular atomic kind of phase of things. So we kind of said like, okay, that's really interesting. How cool would it have been, in my career if I had had access to something like an AWS for cybersecurity, right? If there's an AWS somewhere where I could go and like provision 100 endpoints, EDRs, if I wanted to, and deploy them and not talk to anybody, because, still today it's very like, you want an EDR, okay.
It's a huge sales cycle. Every time you want to buy a license, you go through it, right? Even if it's a SaaS product, right? CrowdStrike's hosted, Palo Alto's hosted. You're not like deploying a server for it. You don't have to. But it's still a hell of a sales cycle to like get those licenses. Yeah,
exactly. Even getting the pricing is a sales cycle, which frustrating. So yeah, we kind of started thinking around like, yeah, as security professionals, like we know how to do security, we know how to do threat hunting and all these things. It'd be really amazing to be able to say like, yeah, here's like endpoints, or over a weekend, you know what? I want to go and I want to test, like try to analyze malware. I've never done this before. Again, right? Like just install malware on a VM and have an EDR. Just like, I don't even want to pay for that. Like just get access to the telemetry. And from that kind of scope is where really you kind of, when you start thinking about it in that way, you kind of see that there's a lot of primitives in security that would be really, really cool to have in that kind of space. So EDR being like kind of the first big one for us. But as you're adding, right, like SASE, we talked about like, owning the network pipe and doing, micro segmentation and packet capture and all that stuff. Like it's a lot of power, doing like things like, memory dump at scale, like on thousands of endpoints and collecting data in the cloud. That's really interesting. Anyway, I'll kind of stop there, but like, it keeps going is the idea, right?
So you said something that's really interesting there, and I want to like circle back on that. Like, this is what blew my mind. This Amazon for cybersecurity primitives, where this whole concept of like, if you've got these, if the market, if like EDR is the same across the board, why not pay per minute for an EDR versus pay per year for a license, right? And this idea that you have like these primitives. So again, you're solving a different problem, and I want to start like what is that problem that we're solving for? Because I think if I'm hearing what you've done by taking core components of to the technologies that power a security program, then making them available via an API, you're really kind of unlocking the ability for teams to build their own security program, but like truly build in the same way that the engineering team builds their products. They don't worry about the infrastructure. We build the security program and don't worry about the infrastructure. That's that's the mind bend I'm still getting around. I think it's really cool. So like, talk to me, like, why do people want to build in this way their security programs? Well, what is it for them? I mean, on your website, you guys have talked about companies like Carta, like they've decided like who like owns the equity tables for like everybody that's significant in the world, like really important things, data that they're protecting. Their security team has decided to build on your platform. There are plenty of others who are doing this. What's the drive for this building for yourself?
Yeah, so it will vary a little bit on who we're talking to, right? And again, I'll preface this by saying, I mean, anybody who's done security and has heard what we just talked about, will go like, yeah, it's not for everybody, and that's absolutely correct. Like AWS, right, is not for the dentist's office, like it's not for everybody. But here's the people for who it really is interesting. I would kind of bucket them in like two big buckets. So there's what I'll describe as MSSPs. So a managed security service provider, which I really kind of put everybody that does like MDR and incident response, essentially people that do security for a living as like a business for a lot of other people. And then the second one is today it's tech forward companies, right? Like Carta, like kind of the new generation. Well, I say new generation from a security perspective, but from their perspective, like, they've been there for a little while and they're cloud native, right? It's kind of how we talk about it. So the difference is there's a couple, so you're right. So a couple of different kind of values for those people, right? For the MSSP side of things, it's being unlocked from the vendors. So as an MSSP, I'll pick it. The easiest example is I want to start an MSSP, right? I want to start doing MDR. There's a couple of us doing security. We have like great idea. We want to get in business. Go talk to the current kind of legacy vendors. Like, I don't know if you can even get a call, right? Because you don't have 2,000 endpoints. They will not talk to you.
Yep. And then there's the whole thing around pricing and terms. And then if you're a startup and in the security space, you're like, great, I need $2 million of pre-committed spend in the security tools in hope that in that next 12 months, I can make $3 million in sales. Yeah,
exactly. Which is really, really hard. And, so they're kind of stuck between kind of couple of choices, right? Now they either say, okay, we're going to use whatever our initial customer has and we're going to manage it. And that's good, but you're going to get stuck managing, 10 different products across all your different customers, trying to glue it all together. You're going to lose a lot of time there. Or, and again, some people say we're going to build it, which is becoming a really, really expensive proposition nowadays. So, you could say, I'm going to raise $2 million and kind of over the next 2 years, we're going to build our EDR. Again, not the greatest. But when you start to think about it in terms of AWS, then it means, you're right. Like I can go get focus on getting your first customer and build like your test infrastructure and like on the free tier, right? It doesn't cost anything. You get ready, you go pitch, you get that first customer. Now you pay for it. And you get started right from the get-go in a position of scalability. It's kind of, I think, the undervalued thing here. As an MSSP, think of when you get to, the stage where you have like 10, 20, 30, 40 customers. Scaling is going to become harder and harder.
Yeah.
And the longer you push it forward, like the more expensive it's going to be. So why not just start on like an AWS, right? Where you pay as you go. Your value is not the EDR, right? It goes back to the whole, like, General Motors doesn't put an AWS sticker on their cars because nobody cares.
Yeah.
So it's more subtle. It is more nuanced in the EDR space, but still there's a little bit of that. So, then those guys are able to kind of go to market really quickly, scale really easily. There's a whole and add value, honestly, right? They're not just deploying an antivirus that some other vendor did and then watching the blinking red light, which as a security professional, you kind of die inside if that's what you do.
Yeah, you do. Because that's the other thing is like, then you read and you're like, oh, great. I just saw that, I read this thing in this research paper, this new adversary was found using new techniques. I don't have, great, and have to wait 9 months for it to go through, through the vetting cycle of vendor du jour, and then I get to be protected by it. Versus if one is building their own, they can show up with, and I suppose it goes back to that conversation with the MSSP. Like, that's your value add. You can engineer a solution. Hey, we just saw a threat actor. Here's the thing. We've used these primitives to build a protection against that on you go.
Mm-hmm. And you can even build kind of, further than that, right? Like the way that we see it, it's you can perform security, you can do security, that's good. Mm-hmm. But once, let's say you've got a couple customers, right? And you're doing security for them. You're security professionals. I'm sure you have a lot of interesting ideas. You think that you have a great way to detect, like dynamic DNS used by like some malware, or do machine learning on user behavior, right? The value is not in, again, getting that data. So by being with LimaCharlie, what you're able to do is you can just say one morning you wake up and you go, okay, I'm going to spin up, an ELK cluster here. And I want all my user, everything that's got a username in it to just go to this S3 bucket or to this ELK cluster. And I'm going to play with it like this weekend and do that in 5 seconds, right? You don't have to go back to customers and go like, wait, we could deploy some file beats and, we could do all that stuff. It's just, you're just leveraging the capabilities that you want to build things. And then who knows, maybe, you find that it's like super valuable and now you can start selling that as a product.
This is really cool. Yeah. And I just you guys are pretty open. You've got some really good partners. Like you must have mentioned, Carta's using it, Snapchat's using you, working with you guys using us. You got a few other folks on the website that's, anyone who's listening to this can jump over to LimaCharlie.io. And I'll put notes in the show notes for this because I know I've said this like 4 times, but it blew my mind that oh my God, someone's actually thought this through. Like we don't have to start from scratch every time we want to use these primitives and going through. So when you think about the core building blocks of a security program, we've mentioned EDR/the XDR story. What are the other primitives that you think need to be present for there to be a meaningful security program? And I imagine it's what LimaCharlie's offering,
Yeah. So yes, and that's not this is not a direct application of hey, what LimaCharlie offers, right? But at a higher level.
Yeah.
At a higher level, I think, priority 1 in my mind is visibility and actionability, right? If you can't see it or you can't do anything about it, or you have to, ship hard drives across the country or tell somebody to run through the hallway to go turn off that box, fundamentally, you're not going to have a whole lot. So that's certainly it. The second aspect, which I think has been kind of historically very, what's the word? Kind of not ignored, but kind of as a secondary thing is just hygiene, IT hygiene. Mm-hmm. I've been in companies that have been really amazing at it, and being really good at IT hygiene. The simple stuff, right? Don't be admin, or whitelist the extensions that people can install in their browser, that kind of stuff. Having this cuts down the requirement on all the really complicated stuff by so much. You can get away with having a lot less. So I think that's a big one. And then for me, the last kind of part in the, in a bit the trifecta, I guess, sort of thinking about it is around inventory management. I'm not saying anything new here. And you know what? That's a sign of a maturing industry, right?
Yeah. It's we're saying the same things. It's okay, folks, let's work on this. What do you got? Can you see what's happening? Can you do the hygiene components of that? Cool. Now let's talk. Then we get into the advanced capabilities of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you've been pretty active in the security industry for quite a while, right? You've built your whole career in this space. I mean, it didn't take me long to find that, you've been a speaker at Black Hat. I think back in 2017, you did that. You're actively contributing to open source projects. Up till 5 minutes before this podcast recording, you had something on the Sigma project. So what keeps you engaged, right? You're running a company that's scaling, you're landing these huge brand names, and you're still here. You're still like part of this community. You're still every day and week giving back. I'm just curious of like, what are some of like how do you do that? I think the real question I'm trying to ask here is like, how do you balance that? How do you bring that? How do you do that?
That's an interesting question. It's hard, right? Like blanket statement, like, yeah, this is really hard. But I think for me, I see it as an extension of, I don't see it as a separate thing from like my day job, for example, right? I see it as an extension in the sense that from the beginning, we've made the very conscious decision to focus on the things that security people need to do. Rather than what's the label that people are going to put on us in the marketplace, right? And what that translates into is that we we want to touch a lot of the things that like it's not directly our business, but great things that others do, and that we can just enable better for people, right? The example that comes to mind is the thing we just recently did, which was the Atomic Red Team, right?
Yes.
So Mitre framework, like super interesting. I mean, yeah, I won't get into it like a ton of depth. Atomic Red Team is kind of like the de facto standard around, we know bad things. How do we test for bad things? Mm-hmm. And so like from my perspective and our perspective, we kind of looked at this and said like, look, the industry will be so much better off if people can do this easily. What are the ways that we can, in our own way, make this easier for people to do and kind of, nudge the industry in the direction that we think is right? Mm-hmm. Which is like measuring things, right? The Sec DevOps concept, right? To kind of wrap it up in a nice bow, right? Sec DevOps and measuring things and measuring when things change in the security posture and the things that we detect, all that stuff. So I think for me, it's just, an extension of that.
Yeah, that's really fantastic, man. I'm really glad that there's this sense of like, while you are running this and building this company, this like deep connection to the problem that you're still solving. I think I see that sometimes with CEOs is they tend to get so consumed inside their own bubble, their own universe, that they lose connectivity with the rest of the community that they're serving. And so you are not doing that. You're deeply involved in that space. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, for me, I'm laughing because for me, I lived this when I left the government. That was like, for me, that was like really a culture shock because in the government, right, nobody ever talks about profit or what total TAM, like total addressable market, or any of those things that you just want to do a good job, and so leaving and going to private sector and kind of like sometimes talking to people that like, and again, like it's a very gray, nuanced topic, but that are there, that are running a business, and that business happens to be security. It's a kind of a different mindset.
Yes, versus trying to move the security industry into a better and healthier place. Yeah, they are different things, and we all hope they line up nicely, right? But
exactly,
don't always.
Exactly. That's right.
So you mentioned the Mitre attack framework, and you wanted to circle back on that. Like, I've been a huge fan of this framework since it came out very early on. As a measurement, I mean, my career has been on the blue team side of the house. I started network security. Before we had all of this, it was just like information assurance and network security, right? So that's kind of how I came up. And then I got into the blue team. And so when Mitre came out, it was, mind blowing for me. I was just like, great, we have this fantastic framework. We get to do these things. And then I stumbled across the Atomic Red Team you just mentioned from the Red Canary folks. That has been an absolute, I mean, it's bigger than them now, but they kind of seeded that project and maintained that project. I'm a huge fan of that. So what was what are your thoughts on the Mitre attack framework? Are you liking how it's developing over time?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying, quite honestly, I don't spend as much time as our users do, right? Like, it's just plain and simple. Like, I don't run security operations for a living anymore. So the relationship I have to it is very different. But I do like that it's expanded in scope, right? I think there's kind of two traps that it could have fallen into, and it hasn't. One being staying just this, Windows only, like small focus, and it hasn't, because now they're expanding, into things like detections around cloud, right?
Yeah.
So like there's cloud APIs and like not vulnerabilities, but techniques around hiding stuff, which is again like this is really cool. So I think that's super super valuable, and that's something we also want to kind of try to help with some more. The other one is that I think in security we've had like a recurring trap sometimes that's been making things work on our computer, right? Which is like the joke in IT, I guess, is like it works on my computer, and building this thing that isn't very well structured, isn't like there's no strong binding, that's just a little too fuzzy, and that you can get some really good value, but as you start and say like, okay, this is good, educate not educationally, but from a scholar perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying to run this into companies with like tens of thousands of assets, and I'm trying to apply this framework or this product or solution, and it doesn't it just doesn't translate. And I think that's been a recurring problem that we've had, and I think it's super super critical, because at the end of the day, the things that need protecting are the things that are outside in the real world, and that have trade-offs. They have ROIs, right? If I'm protecting General Motors, like there are ROIs. I cannot do all the things all the time and look at every alert or everything. So and I think the Mitre framework did not fall into that, which again is like really goes for them in very clearly putting like boundaries and structuring things, so that it's not everything to everybody. And it's not the one thing that solves all the problems, but it very clearly has its rightful place in that kind of ecosystem in my mind.
Yeah, that's a really good call out. And I think that I see this often. We're like, hey, we want this unified framework. We want this unified thing that like this other, like, it doesn't really work that way, right? But I really like that the Mitre tech, as you mentioned specifically, like being bounded to its original mission. Be really good at what it is and don't be something you're not. Expand where it makes sense. You mentioned cloud security. I want to get some of your thoughts on that in a second. But then allow the professionals to be professionals and say, okay, board of directors, here are the 3 different frameworks that we use, and they have these different boundaries. And then you as a security or technology leader can show up and be like, I'm using the Mitre to understand my detection response. I'm using my CIS to talk about my hygiene. I'm using my NIST cybersecurity frameworks to talk about my risk management. Like, you get to pick and choose as a security leader what makes sense for the context versus trying everybody to be frameworks for everything, So.
Yeah, exactly. Which is something we have to fight as well within our own selves as well, right? Sometimes it's worth not building.
I think we have to fight that as humans. Like, just the fact that we're here on this planet trying to appease everybody. It's like, no, okay, man, I got my lane. Like, I'm great at this thing. Sorry, it's not your thing, Yeah. That's great. So you mentioned cloud security there for a second. I wanted to get your thoughts. We're seeing the folks who kind of the biggest cloud security, and specifically around container security. Like, just when people are embarking on this journey, it's like, yay, we get scale. Yay, we get this developer empowerment story. But there's actually quite a bit of risk that shows up in that spend, and like protecting that. I'm just curious if you have any thought for the listenership about, like, as a security and technology leader, as you're looking at a cloud native world where everything's running in a container, what is there thoughts you have around how you would go about protecting that well?
That's a really tough question. I think I would zoom out one scope from that and say the thing that scares me, right? There's a lot of technical questions and aspects of like container security. But personally, I think the much scarier problem is by zooming out one level and say, what are you running within those containers? And generally speaking, what are we running in even in IT, right? It's not just a security thing, but in IT, what are we running? And we are all benefiting a tremendous amount from open source. Like, there's no doubt that like the open source movement is entirely what created the current, the current IT ecosystem. But it also means that even things produced by big companies are really, it's a Jenga tower I think there's like an XKCD a couple of days ago or something like that. Somebody kind of showing like the stack of software and like, this company builds this product. And then way down is like, there's a dependency maintained by some guy in his basement in Ohio that, it's code that was built in 1993. And it's like
so that's why we have all these software supply chain risks, right? Wasn't that the whole thing with Heartbleed? That like the SSL libraries under the hood was literally maintained by like two guys in their basement?
Exactly. And it's also like even in there's been a couple incidents in the past years, slightly different, but in the Node.js world, right? Where somebody decides to like delete their one-liner, null module. And it turns out that, 10 dependencies deep, like a Google library relies on that. And now it just broke, it not broke security, but it broke, building across the planet for all React apps. Yeah. And that's IT, right? That's an IT risk. Like, building broke, not the end of the world. But then, Heartbleed, when you start to kind of look at it sideways and say like, what are the security implications that however neat and hygienic you try to be in the product that you're building, you're still relying on those things. And at the end of the day, if that dependency gets compromised, it doesn't really, you can do a lot of things around container security, right? Microsegmentation, and that's all great, but at the foundation, like, you're kind of screwed a little bit.
Totally. And by the way, I think for the folks who are going to listen to this, by the time the show notes go out, the XKCD cartoon, I will hunt that down and find it because I do love a good XKCD. They hit things so well. So, mate, you've been really building out this this new platform, this new way of imagining doing security programs, which is really, again, building out these primitives, everything from plugins in your Chrome browser to container security to the SASE stuff to the XDR, EDR space. Like, these are really big things. So, and people can build on top of them. I'm just curious, like, where are you taking this next? Where are you going? So the degree that you feel comfortable sharing, I would love to know, where is Maxime? What problem are you going to conquer next? Where are you taking this?
We're it's pretty topical. So we're about to kind of go into an open beta for this next thing. What we're doing is we're trying to crystallize a little bit more the concept, the model for LimaCharlie, right? So we talked about EDR. You mentioned what we call nets, like a SASE product, right? To have the network, a Chrome plugin, and we've kind of started adding those capabilities. And we got, a little bit of a spider filling where we're like, that's kind of starting to have a very wide spread. We need to think about, how do we think about this, and how do we expand from there? We could keep, layering on, adding solutions, but it feels like there's something underlying there. And so our conclusion is essentially that we're saying, look, really what we're doing is we're bringing telemetry within LimaCharlie. So we say telemetry, meaning, it's not the content of your email, but it's, security information, right? Maybe audit logs from like AWS and like, syslog from your web proxy and like all these things. And we're bringing it into LimaCharlie. And so we can think about all of these things as sensors. So we really kind of double down on the word sensor. For us, it was important because it really starts to, put an overarching concept over it. And so what we're doing is we are open sourcing a protocol for sensors that's based on WebSocket and JSON. So we wanted to say this thing can live anywhere. And so we took a lot of the concepts we had around EDR and made them more generic, more kind of reliable. And now we can start opening it up as a protocol. So it's open source. And then what we're doing as like a first step is we're building an adapter, right? So we're building a way of taking external data sources and bringing them into LimaCharlie in the first class pipeline. So it's not like we're bringing it in and dumping it in a bucket somewhere, but rather we're saying it's just like EDR telemetry. It comes in, it's analyzed at wire speed. You can correlate things, you can forward it wherever you want, like all the things. And so what we're doing with that to allow us to start saying, okay, you've got like some syslog, you can bring it in, and you can define how you want it parsed. And we'll parse it into JSON, and again, it goes right in the platform. You want to bring your CloudTrail audit logs, you can bring that in the platform. But also that extends it to other products. So for example, you have Carbon Black. We have some MSSPs that are using LimaCharlie, and they say like, hey, we really love LimaCharlie, and we love the EDR and being on the platform. But some of our customers, they're like mid-cycle, they can't change, they have Carbon Black. We just want to work with you guys. So that will be a way we're going to be bringing in Carbon Black sensors, first class in the chart.
That is really powerful because so by having it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but what I'm hearing is this like a translation layer is not quite right, but it's something where it's like a normalization where you can take other feeds, other sensors, bring it into and convert it into a normalized open source protocol standard, and then build on top of that.
That's right. That? Yes, that's pretty much it. The only thing is we don't want to fall into the trap of saying, hey, we normalize everything that comes on the platform into this, unified data model or something like that. We don't feel super comfortable with that because it implies that all things can be normalized without loss. And for us, that's not the right trade-off. So instead, what we're saying is default is we'll normalize the data format as into JSON. And LimaCharlie operates onto JSON, so everything just works. Like the automation. So if you have, we've got people that, they build their own, an app that does, I don't know, some secure email gateway somewhere that produces its own telemetry, and they want to be able to correlate that with their EDR stuff and like other log sources. It's open source, so they're able to just add that to their app and start shipping that telemetry into LimaCharlie. And get all the value from it. And so EDR is a little bit like that. EDR, we do add a little bit of normalization to make it look like the EDR data from our sensors on top of keeping the original. So if people want to normalize onto LimaCharlie EDR, like that's better.
Again, I love this concept because then when you start thinking of it again, like as primitives, like you get to build on top of this, that's when the magic starts coming when you have that. Yeah, very exciting stuff, dude. I'm really excited you guys have this endeavor, this enterprise that's going forward. Really excited about it. So I want to switch gears here as we're coming to the top of the hour. And I want to ask you my two favorite questions that I ask all my guests who come on the show who are gracious enough to indulge me these two. So let me bring us to question number one. If you rewind the clock 10 years and you think of yourself, where were you then? You can love to if you want to describe it, don't feel you have to, but what would be the career advice that you would have given yourself 10 years ago?
I think I would have said, participate in more things in the industry. So put yourself more out there in terms of like open source projects or working with companies or just doing more things outside, because there's very, very few reasons to if you're working alone on something, what the good that can come out of that is very limited. it's all about working with other people to kind of get there.
That's really powerful. Yeah. Really, like your ability to have impact, your ability to have meaning is related, is like directly correlates to the amount of people you're working with. Right? If you're just by yourself, you can only impact yourself. Gotcha.
That's right.
Okay. And now, what is the one innovation that you wish every security or technology leader would embrace?
So innovation is like, I mean, it depends a little bit on your definition, right? So I think it's going to be close enough, which is to say, tearing down the barriers in the product. I think the reason that open source has built the modern world in many ways, right, from a technological perspective, is because there were no barriers. And I wish that products out there started from the position of removing those barriers. So those barriers could be, we talked about like the EDR, right? Like buying a product, but even knowledge, right? What do you do? What's your approach, to things, and kind of sharing those more widely? Because at the end of the day, that's not usually what makes the difference, right? That's just a net positive for everybody. I think if we share more of what we're all doing.
Yeah. Oh, I love how those two are so closely related, both the career advice and the innovation. You're like, I see a theme here. I see a theme.
That's true. I just realized too. Yeah.
Well, Maxime, you've been such an incredible guest. Thank you so much for your time. And I will say to everybody who is listening here, jump over to LimaCharlie.io. Take a look. There's an incredible blog, lots of resources. You can reach out and connect there, or connect with Maxime on LinkedIn and or Twitter. All of those will be in the show notes. And the Twitter is @_MaximeLB. MaximeLB. So connect with him there, or the company over at LimaCharlie.io. Maxime, thanks again. Awesome guest. Great conversation. I can't wait to see more of your future success.
Thank you. That was I had a lot of fun, so that's good. Always happy.
Okay, guys, until next time, we'll see you back here. See you next week on the Confident Defense Podcast.